In 1863, a mining engineer named Charles Whittlesey published a paper for the Smithsonian Institution on the ancient copper workings of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. He was not a crank. He had served on the Geological Survey of Ohio and did what geologists do: walked, measured, wrote it down. What he wrote down did not look like anything else in North America. Along the Keweenaw Ridge and on Isle Royale, across a belt 150 miles long, there were pits cut into solid rock. Not one and not 10, thousands. Some waist deep, some 20 feet down, following the vein exactly, abandoned and silted in, with trees 200 rings old grown out of the bottoms. In the pits and around them lay stone hammers. Whittlesey started counting them and stopped. Others counted after him and stopped too. On Isle Royale they were carted off by the wagon load and dumped as waste rock. Keweenaw copper is unlike anything else on the planet. Nearly everywhere on Earth copper must be smelted out of ore, and knowing how is the line separating the Stone Age from metal. Here you do not smelt. The metal sits in the basalt in its pure state, from grains to masses weighing tons, workable out of the rock with no furnace, no fuel, and no flux. People began taking it here at least 6,000 years ago, and kept taking it for thousands of years, and Lake Superior copper went out across the continent. It turns up in burials from the Gulf of Mexico to Manitoba. None of that is disputed, and none of it is hidden. There are monographs about it. It sits in museum cases, and the descendants of the people who did it live on the same ground today. Somewhere in the 19th century, somebody took those pits and converted them into tons. The answer came out at 1.5 million tons, 1 billion pounds of copper. The figure went into books, and out of those books into other books, and from there into articles, and it has been repeated for 1.5 centuries, sometimes as fact, sometimes hedged as an estimate, never with any indication of who did the arithmetic or how. It is in guidebooks, in documentaries, and in half of what you find on this subject in 5 minutes. It is the most quoted number in the archaeology of the Great Lakes. I am not going to tell you yet where it came from. You will understand when we get to Block 5. The first thing to understand about Whittlesey is that he was careful in a way almost nobody who cites him has been since. He measured pits. He gave depths and diameters. He described the fill and the trees growing in it, and used the rings to argue a minimum age, which is a legitimate method and good reasoning for 1863. He described the hammers, water-worn beach cobbles of hard rock, some grooved for hafting, most not, battered at one end and cracked through from use. He noted the wooden implements coming out of the waterlogged pits, bowls and levers and shovels of shaped timber, and he understood at once why they had survived. They had been underwater since the day they were dropped. And he was explicit that he did not know how much copper had been taken out. He said the workings were extensive. He said the labour had been enormous. What he did not do was multiply. That restraint lasted about as long as he did. Within a generation his measurements had been detached from his caution. The pits had become a total, the total a fact, and the fact had the shape it still has. An enormous round figure with nothing underneath it. You can watch it happen in the sources if you have the patience. An early writer says the workings imply a very great quantity. The next converts very great into an approximate tonnage, because prose is vague and a number is useful. The one after that drops the word approximate, because he is quoting a published figure, and published figures do not need hedging. By the fourth remove somebody is citing the third, and the hedge is gone entirely, and the sentence now reads as though a man once stood on that ridge with a tape and a notebook and worked it out. Nobody ever did. a familiar enough process and unremarkable, except for one thing about this number. It did not merely survive, it became useful. Before we go further, understand what these people did, because the scale is not in dispute, and it is more impressive than the mythology built on top of it. Radiocarbon dates from the Lake Superior Basin push copperworking back at least 6,000 years, among the earliest metal use anywhere in the world, and older than much of what the textbooks call the beginning of the Bronze Age. Archaeologists call the tradition the Old Copper Complex. They made awls, fish hooks, harpoon heads, adzes, crescent knives, socketed spear points folded and hammered closed, and beads by the thousand. The method was cold hammering with annealing. Beat the metal, heat it until the crystal structure softens, beat it again. That is not banging one rock on another. It is a technique with a temperature and a sequence, and it was worked out here independently by people who had no reason to believe it was possible until they tried. And the copper travelled. Lake Superior metal turns up in burials across the eastern half of the continent, hundreds, and in some cases well over 1,000 miles from the ridge it came out of, which means exchange networks ran that distance 6,000 years before there was a road. It is worth pausing on the dates, because they do not sit where most people assume. 6,000 years ago there were no pyramids, there was no writing anywhere, Stonehenge had not been started. Copper metallurgy in the Old World was beginning at roughly the same time, on the other side of an ocean, with no possible contact between the two. This is not a footnote to the story of metal. It is one of the places where the story of metal begins, and it begins on a ridge above a lake in Michigan. All of this is published, taught, and displayed, and every part of it makes the missing number worse rather than better, because if you cannot say how much came out of that ground, you cannot say how much of that trade you are actually looking at. The mining itself is what makes the arithmetic feel urgent. Basalt is hard. The native copper is locked into it, and getting it out with stone means one of two things. The first is fire setting, old and universal and brutally effective. Build a fire against the rock face, keep it burning, then quench it, and the thermal shock cracks the stone into pieces you can pry loose. The second is hammering, endlessly, with beach cobbles carried up from the shore. The hammers in those pits are not chipped, they are broken, through the body, which is what happens to a cobble after enough impacts, and they lie in the workings in quantities that stopped being countable the moment anybody tried. Under and around them come the wooden tools, levers, wedges, bowls for bailing water, all of it preserved in the wet fill. Some pits show timber cribbing holding back the walls. Some follow a vein down at an angle for 20 feet and more, which means somebody was lifting broken rock out by hand in a place where the ground is frozen half the year. Try to price that in effort for a moment. A single pit 20 feet deep in basalt is not a season of work. It is fires burned against a face over and over, cobbles carried up from the beach until they shattered and carried up again, rock lifted out in baskets, water baled by hand, all of it stopping when the lake froze and the ground went solid. Multiply that by the number of pits, and you are describing thousands of person years, sustained across a span longer than the recorded history of Europe. Whatever the real tonnage was, every pound of it was moved by a person with a stone in their hands. Which is precisely why the number matters, and precisely why the way it was arrived at cannot be defended. Here is what happens when you go looking for the source. You find a citation. The citation points to an earlier work, that work to an earlier one, and you keep walking backward expecting to arrive at a survey, a table of measured pits, an average volume, an assumed copper fraction, a stated margin of error, and you never arrive. There is no such survey. The archaeologist Susan Martin worked through this properly and published the result. The enormous tonnage figures that saturate the popular literature on Lake Superior copper have no methodological basis and cannot be traced to any systematic study. They are 19th century guesses that were repeated until repetition made them look like measurement. And the foundation under the guess is worse than absent, because the pit count itself is contaminated. In the 1840s, the Keweenaw copper rush arrived, and the prospectors did the obvious and intelligent thing. They used the ancient workings as a map. Where the old pits were, the vein was. So they dug beside them, on top of them, and into them, sank their own prospect holes by the thousand across the same ground, and walked away from those as well. A century later, anybody counting depressions on that ridge is counting both, and from the surface there is frequently no way to tell them apart. There is a second contamination on top of the first, and it runs the other way. A pit is not a measure of copper, it is a measure of digging. Two holes of identical size can have produced a mass weighing a ton and nothing at all, because the metal is spread unevenly through the rock, and prospecting means failing most of the time. Some proportion of those pits are places where somebody worked hard and found nothing, and there is no way to tell from the whole which is which. So the most quoted number in Great Lakes archaeology is an unsourced multiplication applied to a count that includes an unknown quantity of 19th century holes and an unknown quantity of failures, which means the honest figure is not higher and it is not lower. It does not exist. And the moment you say that out loud, you discover you have annoyed two completely different groups of people at the same time. Now I will argue against my own video, because there is a serious objection here, and it comes from the mining side rather than the archaeological one. It runs like this. Saying the number cannot be checked assumes the evidence is still there, and for the richest ground, it is not. The industrial mines of the Keweenaw ran for over a century, and they followed the same veins the ancient workings followed, because there was only one place the copper was, which means the largest and most productive prehistoric workings, the ones that would dominate any total, were exactly the ones cut away and shipped off as ore in the 1850s and 60s. The pits left standing to be measured are disproportionately the small ones on the poor ground nobody bothered with, so a careful recount would not produce a corrected figure. It would produce a flaw derived from the leftovers, and it would be quoted as a total the same way the old number is. That is a good argument, and I do not have a clean answer to it. But look at what it concedes on the way past. It agrees the current figure is unfounded. It agrees the ground has been destroyed. Its only quarrel is over whether anything better can be built in its place, and that is a question about method, not evidence. And there is a method, and it does not involve counting holes at all, which leaves the harder objection, and I will put it at full strength because somebody in the comments will otherwise put it better. It is this: who cares? The tonnage is a curiosity. The dating does not depend on it, and the significance of the tradition does not depend on it, and an archaeologist with limited funding has 50 better uses for a year. That one I can answer. That number is not inert. Nobody invented that tonnage in order to deceive anybody, and there is no file on it anywhere. What happened is duller, and it explains far more. A number survives when somebody needs it, and this one has been needed for a century and a half by groups with nothing else in common. In the 1840s, it was needed by mining promoters because an enormous prehistoric yield was the best argument available that the district was rich, and a share in it worth buying. Then it was needed by the 19th century notion that the earthworks and mines of North America were the work of some vanished civilized race, rather than the ancestors of the people living beside them. A convenient idea for a country in the middle of taking that land, and a big number made the vanished race look impressive. That idea has been dead in scholarship for a long time, The figure built to carry it outlived it, and now it is needed again by anybody making content on this subject, because £1 billion is a hook, and nobody clicks on a number with an error bar attached. 3 constituencies across 3 centuries, none with the slightest incentive to open the arithmetic. And there is a 4th group, which is the uncomfortable one. The inflated figure is load-bearing for a whole genre of speculation about who really mined that copper and where it supposedly went. And that genre is not a harmless eccentricity, because its entire point is that the people whose ancestors demonstrably did the work could not have done it. Take away the impossible tonnage, and the speculation has nothing left to be impossible about. Which means the single most effective thing anybody could do to that genre is arithmetic. That is not suppression. Suppression can be exposed. This is a number that keeps being handed forward because every generation finds a use for it, and the people who might have checked it never did, because it was never their claim to begin with. Here is the way out, and it has been available for years. Stop trying to measure the holes and measure the metal instead. Native copper is not chemically identical everywhere. It carries trace elements and isotopic ratios that vary between deposits, and those signatures can be read out of a finished piece. The technique is standard in archaeometallurgy. It is how the ancient Mediterranean metal trade was reconstructed, and it works on Lake Superior metal. Which matters because the artifacts are not lost. They are in museum collections across the continent, catalogued and curated, in drawers from the Gulf Coast to the Canadian prairie, in the tens of thousands. Every one of them is a piece of copper with its place of origin recorded inside it. That will not give you a tonnage, and I want to be straight that it never will. What it gives you is better than a tonnage. It gives you a distribution, how far the metal went, in what quantity, in which directions, and in which centuries. And the work has begun. Sourcing studies on North American native copper exist, have been running for decades, and have already produced results nobody guessed in advance, including evidence that more than one deposit was in use, and that the Lake Superior monopoly assumed by earlier writers was not a monopoly at all. What has never happened is the scale. The studies are small and scattered across separate projects with separate funding, and nobody has pulled the collections together into one continental picture, because that is nobody's grant. And the surviving ground has not been abandoned either, because Isle Royal is a national park, and it has been laser scanned, and pit clusters show up in bare earth elevation data about as clearly as anything in archaeology. The workings the mining companies never reached can be mapped without a shovel, out of data that already exists. This is where I stop narrating and say the plain thing. Everything needed to replace that number already exists, and most of it is public. The museum collections are catalogued and searchable. The sourcing technique is established, published, and routine. The elevation data over Isle Royal has been flown and paid for. Whittlesey's paper is a Smithsonian publication you can read tonight for nothing. What is missing is not access, method, or money. What is missing is that £1 billion is a better line than the truth, and the truth would cost somebody a year of their life, and would end in a sentence with a range in it instead of a headline. That is the whole obstacle, not secrecy, a number that is more entertaining than the answer. Charles Whittlesey measured pits, reported what he measured, and said plainly he did not know the total. He is the only person in this entire story who behaved correctly, and the thing that carries his name forward is a figure he refused to produce. Meanwhile, the copper is not a mystery, and the miners are not a mystery. They have descendants, on that ground, now, and the number that has been used for 1.5 centuries to turn their ancestors into somebody else was never a measurement in the first place. If you think the most quoted figure in Great Lakes archaeology deserves one honest recount, leave a comment, because comments are the only thing that makes a subject visible, and send this to anyone you know who works with museum collections or reads elevation data for a living. The algorithm decides what gets seen, you decide what stays. And hold on to the shape of this, because £1 billion of copper is not the only unsourced number holding up a field. Once you have watched one of them come apart, you start seeing the others.